There we go. The idea today is we are planning to do a review on the most critical inputs for corn. You will see most of the information being on plant density and action, fertilizers, so we will discuss about that. That will be a critical point. I have with me our just recently honored Dr. Adrian Correndo. He also will be presenting part of the presentation, part of the research that he did was specifically about, we never really have too many discussions trying to understand this idea of the optimal fertilization. Okay, we always discuss about, I will talk a little bit about the plant density, but we always believe that it's a number. So, and then we will finish the presentation talking about this idea that it's not a magical number. So don't come to expect that I will give you just one number only. We will be discussing more about also what are the ranges, how much uncertainty is when we are defining those numbers. Okay? And I want to make sure that you get this from the presentation today, because when you are taking the decision of what is your optimal plant density, or even how much nitrogen you need to apply to your crops, you need to realize that that is not a number. In many situations, someone might say 120. How do you know? Well, it's based on research. We will show that some of that research also shows that it's not 120 never. That in many situations it's plus minus. And that plus minus is not a small number, okay? So we need to start thinking about what is the risk that you are taking and how much risk you want to take. Okay? So that's the main idea of the presentation. So Adrian will jump on the second part of specifically to introduce all the nitrogen research that he did on his PhD. So he's now helping us doing a lot of presentation work, now being a more a postdoc. So, okay. So as you see, the outline for the presentation, the first topic will be plant density. I will introduce some ideas because we always talk about for corn, the kernel number is extremely important. We never discuss too much about the contribution of kernel weight. I will show some new data that introduce that concept. And the last step is what Adrian will be talking a little bit about the nitrogen. Okay? We have some new research, and I think that it's very relevant to start thinking about this idea that not all is a number. Okay? And also at the end, we will discuss about this idea of how we're going to start shifting. Since we're in a new year, although things look the same sometimes, or maybe very similar to 2021 or 2020, but hopefully 2022 will be a little bit different. But since we're in a new year, we are trying to start changing mentality. So, and then this shift in mentality hopefully will go in that direction. So the first things that we need to discuss when we are talking about this, we need to talk about one of the big factors when we are thinking of corn. We're looking at the yield as a critical factor, and then there are different components. Today on the presentation, we will not be discussing too much on the hybrid selection, but we have many multiple hybrids. Most of the research is being done by the industry today on the hybrid. Planting date is a factor, row rotation, row spacing, seeding rate, fertility with controls. I mean, Sarah was discussing on this, and then also scouting. Okay? Scouting means like going to the field as frequent as possible. Okay? And I would say, from my opinion, most of the things that these are the most relevant factors when we're looking about yield and yield potential for corn. We have some new research that we are working on. We can talk later in the presentation about planting dates. I know that some people is working on this, but today we decided to focus on the most critical inputs, okay? And those decisions that you guys need to take this year, that they are the amount of seeds that you buy, what is the decision on the plant density and the fertility, and the fertilizer. I think that you are familiar with this. We have a lot of publications that I brought that they are at the reception. So if you want the break or at any point, we have this that is a growth and development. So we usually go all the time with this growth and development. because this is the basis for corn. Okay? And here you will see that we will talk about plant density, which is the most critical factor early in the season. Then we will move to the definition of the kernel number, and then the last step for corn is the definition of the kernel weight. Okay? So if you go following the life cycle, the first step is the decision of the number of plants. So in order to consider that point of the plant density, so we need to understand what happened in the past. And then, as you know, I mean, if you look at the data, we have a lot of information that we put in the last couple of years. These are the main changes on plant density. Okay? Over time, if you look at the last almost 50 years in many situations, we always are seeing an increasing trend. Anytime that you are increasing yields, in corn, the way that we break the crop is that we need to put more plants. Okay? And not only that, is that the new hybrids, they are more tolerant. So if you think about in the 1980s, if you are planning to use 24,000 or 28,000 in some environments, many of these hybrids, they will not do really well. They will crash. In many situations, you have an optimum that was so narrow, that was the optimum. Today, you will see that plant density is a big factor, but now you might use 24, 26, 28, and you will find that there's not a lot of difference. For one point is nice, because it's good for you guys to have more room to play, but then for the other part, it's also a little dangerous, because now you don't know exactly until where. And sometimes we might be too short, or we might be even too far from the optimum. So if you look at this graph, it shows that as you are increasing yields, in this case it's only in plant density, all the data is coming from multiple locations, and we are focusing on trying to collect data on the optimal plant density, how the optimal plant density changes over time. So if you look at this graph, you can look at this graph connected to the next one. That the next one shows the changes in yield connected to those plant densities. Okay? These are the changes over time. So we went all the way from 120, 130 bushels. Today we are in many of these environments looking at plant density trials, close to 200 bushels. Okay? And clearly, if you look at the relationship between plant density and yield, in many situations you will find that it's very linear until a point that reaches some kind of a plateau in many situations. And then if you look at the next one, probably it's the one that is you can spend some time today because it's the most attractive. When you look at the different responses to plant density, so I have here in this graph, in the y-axis yield, bushels per acre, and then in the x we have the plant densities. So what you're seeing there, the different kind of responses are different hybrids, different decades. Going all the way from older hybrids, from the 1980s, all the way to the blue line, which is the newer hybrids. So although I put some information there, I want for you guys to tell me two things that you can see from this graph. There are two things that are clear. Can you tell me what's going on with the older hybrids? If you look at the purple, yeah, plant density is going up over time. Plant density goes up as you are getting more yield. Okay, that's one. But it's one thing. Yield is going up over time. What happens to the optimal density? If you look at the shaded areas, there is a hint on the graph showing you something. What happened to that optimal density? Exactly. The optimal plant density was widening up. So for all hybrids, the optimal density was really close to a number. If you look at the purple line, the optimal plant density for 130 bushels in that scenario was between 28, 26,000. But it was really close. If you were beyond that number, if you were passing the optimal, you start seeing that the plant is going to stop. In fact, when you are doing this, you create more stress. And in many situations, you start seeing the yields starting going down. So what happens to the modern hybrids? The modern hybrids, if you look at the blue line, it doesn't show that response. In many situations, you could be or achieve similar yield levels when you are in 28, 30, 32, 34, okay? And that is something nice because it gives you more opportunities for not shooting for the number. Because if you are not in the number, then you are wrong. In this case, you can just, you know that you have some wiggle room. Then you can go and use 30, 32, or 34, and you will be fine. Still, the challenge is how do you find the optimum? Because the good thing is that most companies, they don't penalize you if you are a full manager. That's good news. The problem is still you need to be an excellent manager to make sure that you're working hard. And also you don't want to share, because if you want to share, then you will not capture the gains. If you want to really go and 22 of those scenarios, you will need to make numbers. You are leaving in the table. Okay? These are things that we were looking at when you think about new hybrids and the yield correlation. So in general, when you look at the different plant densities, it shows something like this on the next one. It will show all the different scenarios. And I want to make sure that when we discuss with many farmers, we say, you always have variability in the fields. Always. I'd like to show this one, and I want to make sure that I will do a disclaimer. This graph that you see there is a good starting point. What I'm saying is a good starting point. Imagine that this is like a book. Okay? It's a good book. This is the cover of the book. This tells you that if I have environments in my field that they yield less than 100 bushels, your optimal density should be less than 20,000 plants. If I have an environment in my field that I can achieve or get to more than 100 bushels, then I can start pushing on plant density. And then if I have an environment that I can get to 150, 170 bushels, then I can start pushing to higher densities. And if I have a really good environment, that usually get to more than 100 bushels every year, then my plant density needs to be very high. It needs to be, I mean, if you look at the numbers, it needs to be more than 12. And this basically tells you that in many situations, you might have the opportunity in your fields to play with this, to start using some of this information, collect data every year, and start thinking about how you can manage different zones in the field. Environments that you will have low yields and environments that you probably have high yields. But these are the basics. You need to do your own research. I always say this is just ABC. But in many situations, I will do my own research, I will collect data from my field, and I will see if this works. Okay? Because in many cases, you need to understand the variability that you have in your field is always the same. If every year is the same, and we have many scenarios that we work with farmers that there are sections in the field, there are some fields that they never change, that every year we have always low yields. If that is the situation, excellent, because that means that you can find as maybe 20 acres or 50 acres that you know that they're always really low. If they're always really low, then you need to start thinking about, okay, I can then start how I can use less plants, and then we will talk about that. The same will be the situation with the fertilizer. If I have a really good environment, and if it's always all the time the same, it's not changing, then you have an opportunity to go and shoot for high yields. Okay? One of the things, and I want to show this graph, and I want to stop here for 1 second, is like, as we started the discussion today, is this scenario. The optimum plant density does not change over time in many situations, unless we have a really huge breeding improvement. In the last 10 years, we have not seen a huge increase in plant densities. So what is next from breeding? Doesn't seem to be too much on the pressure of the plant density. So maybe the next thing could be, I mean, someone is looking at prolificacy or looking at some other things, no? Having 2 years per plant, or looking at just to see, or even some of the companies are looking to short on. I'm not sure how far we can go with short plants. But clearly the plant density seems to be saturated, no? At this point. We are getting to the point that we are achieving really a lot of yield with really high number of plants, and if we put more plants in these environments, we will start making a lot of stress. Okay? And it's a very big risk. Okay?
Did you, in that last slide, did you classify whether they were a flex or they're permanent ear type?
Yes, we did classification. You don't want to know the answer, I think. We did classification. In fact, one time we did classification looking at, I don't know, a data set from multiple states. Yeah. we did one time even classification following the idea of flex versus fix. Yeah. Yeah. I'm a little skeptical on that. Maybe not the best. I might see one hybrid that it does really well. But then when you start looking at multiple hybrids, classify as a flex or fix, no. It's something that you might need to find one specific hybrid that it does really well on this flex and fix, and then you might see some difference. The other thing that you need to understand for everyone here is like when you look at this plant density, sometimes these responses, no? It can change because in many situations when we look at a plant density study, the way that we do a plant density study, you will be changing the distance between plants in a uniform way, or at least the most uniform way possible. But what happens to many of you in the field is that in many situations, the changes that you have on plant density are not uniform. And this is something to consider, that most of the time these responses of yield to plant density are thinking that when I want to go to a lower density, I'm changing my planter, my seeding rates, and I'm doing the gaps very uniformly. But sometimes when you look at what happens really in the field, is that you don't have that situation. You have this, and then the next spacing is this, and the next one is like this, and then when you have those scenarios, the response to plant densities can be different. And then in those scenarios, we are seeing sometimes that to achieve high yields, you need even more plants. Why? Because in many situations, you don't have uniformity. And that's another problem in corn, lack of uniformity. Early season, lack of uniformity compromises everything. All the time. Okay? And we have seen situations that a plant that is coming 2 or 3 weeks after emergence is a plant that in many situations doesn't yield really well. And all the time it's the plant that is being dominated. You go at flowering and you don't see any ears. So you have a plant in the field that doesn't do anything. Okay? And that's a problem. The concept that I want to leave on this section is specifically think about this idea that what I'm showing there in this response now, I'm showing what is the uncertainty of the number. So when I'm telling you the number is 22,000 or 24,000, when you look at the gray bars and the red line, it shows how much is uncertainty. In many situations, we are quantifying that the optimal plant density can be plus minus 2,000 or 3,000 plants. Okay, I will repeat that. The optimal plant density in many situations can be plus minus 2,000 or 3,000 plants. So let's give an example. If you are, I work with Ray a lot. So if Ray is coming and saying, on this field I usually use 24. And I will tell him, yeah, but your optimal density could be 21 or 27. And that depends on the weather in many situations, on the growing season. We will show the data that we have on nitrogen, the effect of the climate. Because you might have a year that you start with a low profile water in the soil, and then you have poor rain, not timely precipitation, and then 21,000 is more than enough. And you have another year probably that you start with a full profile, good rains in July, and then if you didn't put 27 or 28, you never really capture the potential. I want to make sure that we understand, everyone understand this situation, that optimal plant density is never one number. When I work with farmers on the on-farm research that we do all the time, I think that our main goal is to understand, to give the farmer an idea of what is the optimal. But I think that when we finish many of these studies, we never know exactly what is the optimal. Even when we have data from 5 years in the same field, every year the optimal changed. One year was 22, the next year was 24, the last year was 20. But the good feeling for that farmer is that at least you know more or less what is your optimal density. Okay? And based on the inputs, then you can have an idea based on the seed cost and the inputs. What is your wiggle room? Can you go to 16? I will not do it. But then you know that if this year is really tough, and that field is one of the toughest that never really yields very well, you can go low. Most likely because if you do that, then you can go low on the nitrogen. And then put all the inputs on the fields so they yield the best. And make sure that you maximize and don't leave anything behind on those fields. In many situations, when we work with a few farmers on variable rate or seeding rate, we, at the end of the day, even when we work with 5 or 6 fields, we never really reduce the amount of seeds that we finish buying to the dealers, or seed dealers. At the end of the day, we only just optimize the allocation of the inputs. We put less seed on this farm, less nitrogen, and then we put more seed and more nitrogen to this other farm. That was kind of a really good conclusion for many situations. Okay? And then this is what happens. I mean, you probably already know this. I'm giving you 2 examples. I mean, let's focus on Kansas. But we did this to show to everyone that if you look at the plant density, right? If you look at 2012, the plant density, look at the colors. They're almost orange, which means that all the optimal densities were close to 20,000. If you look at 2018, that was a rainy season. Most of the plant densities in this area were closer to 26, 27,000. This is just to show something very simple, that optimal plant density is not always the same. And in many situations it changes with the type of growing season. The problem that you need to ask me is that how do I know what type of season? And then my response on that is like, if I have a response to that, most likely I will not be here. Okay? Most likely I will be in another paradise, maybe enjoying inviting the people to come with me. Because if I can predict the future, then we can solve many problems. But one thing that is true is like, and we are working on this with many of our team, trying to start looking at different signs. If you look at the water available before planting or at planting, that's a really good indicator. That's a really good indicator of what is your potential. Because if you say, I'm starting the season very dry, I have almost no water in the profile, I can tell you that I can show you 100 different forecast scenarios of what the weather will do in June, July, and August. And I will tell you that I don't have any probability to predict anything with any confidence. 0. And whoever tells you that they can predict the weather, good for them. In my scenario, it's like you need to start looking at what was the yield from the last years. Start collecting data to understand how much variability you have in yields from the last year from those fields. Looking at possibilities to start measuring water in the soil. We are looking on some fields and we start putting some sensors so we can start collecting water in the profile, because that will be for anyone. You can take a decision a week before planting or even the same day. You can just say, we went from really dry to really wet, so I will go from 21, now I will put 25. You can just change the decision based on what type of growing season are you planning to expect.
Have you looked at, I guess, recurrent negative impacts? So is it worth shooting for the, what happens if I planted, if I often plant 2012, what's that negative impact versus what's the impact if I don't shoot that yield? In a sense, is it better to play offense or better to play defense?
And that depends, yeah, I kind of look on that. The challenge depends on the seed cost. Because now on the seed cost, we are not that bad. And also, not only in the seed cost, but on the ratio between grain price and seed cost. Now we are not that bad in terms of seed cost. But in many situations, if you think about just from the agronomic, without even thinking about cost, in many situations, my recommendation would be, play safe, go always a little bit up, because you will see that in many situations you don't go down. Okay? But the problem is, if I'm asking you to put 2,000 or 3,000 more seeds, that means some money that you lost, in that situation. If you go too short, that would be a problem. Because in many scenarios, I see the point, you look at the response curve. If you go way too short, you have a problem. On that, I'm talking more from that agronomic point. I think that economics, that's another point that you need to start thinking about. That's why I always say the optimal density is around, 21, 26, 27, so we always are between 5,000, no more than that, 5,000, 6,000 seeds. I don't want to see no one going crazy and going beyond. If your maximum and the best yields are with 28,000, it doesn't make any sense to go to 32. But I'd rather have someone playing safe and going to 25, maybe, to make sure that if the season changes, because we are seeing that the weather is completely crazy. And we start dry today, we might be on the wettest growing season ever. But you don't know. So the question is, what is the risk that you want to take? You want to go and see 21,000, be conservative, and knowing that you will be leaving yield behind. If the growing season starts to be really good, most likely with 21 you will be leaving. Maybe you are leaving probably 10 bushes or more behind. This year I'm more concerned on the economics on the fertilization. And I think that everyone is on the same boat. So from that aspect my recommendation is usually, if I can, when I talk to farmers, I ask them to play safe. And then not to go too short. That's my recommendation. So very quickly we can look at the things that we have on kernel number and kernel weight. So I think that the next one is, This is some data that we just finished processing, looking at historical changes for corn. So, as I mentioned before, the yield for corn, if you look, went up. One of the main responses on the changes on the yield, it was connected to kernel number. So when you look at the next graph, if you look at the kernel number usually explains, okay, having bigger size ears, more kernels, usually explains most of the yield improvement for corn. So today we can put more plants, but also we are seeing that those plants, they have really good ear size. And that's why we are seeing that the yields is going up. We never really put much of a number or influence to say how much the kernel weight. What is the influence of kernel weight? So we need a study now looking at the variability of kernel number and kernel weight. And then you start seeing that in many scenarios, even for some of the late planted corn, I know some of you, kernel weight is a very interesting factor, because in some scenarios we are seeing that, of course, kernel number usually explains 60% of the corn yields, but kernel weight explains 10%. But if you look at the variability in kernel weight, in some scenarios we can see that kernel weight explains up to 35%. 35%, okay, of the yield in corn. And in most of the scenarios are when we are seeing that we are planting late. In those scenarios that you plant late, kernel number is a factor. But in many situations when you have good growing conditions at the end of the season, we start seeing that the kernel weight really helps to maximize. So there is some plasticity. There is some possibility to put more yield when you look at the kernel weight, okay? And we never really even focus on kernel weight. We always talk about kernel number, but kernel weight seems to be an interesting factor for corn. I think that this is just, we discussed many times, and then Adrian will talk more about the nitrogen fertilization. I think that we talk about this, I will go fast. We know that today in corn, we changed the uptake. So if you look at the amount of nitrogen that the corn plant needs, you will see that we are talking in many situations about 300 pounds total in the plant, including the grain, the leaves and the stems. And then the main change that we are seeing with the new hybrids is that today we are seeing more nitrogen coming after flowering. So the plant needs more nitrogen after flowering. In the past, the old hybrids, they didn't need that much nitrogen after flowering, because the time from flowering to maturity was relatively short. Now these new hybrids, they put more plant biomass, they put more green biomass, so they need more nitrogen. That's one of the keys, on the corn yield improvement over time. So how is that coming? In many situations, if you look at the effect on nitrogen, so we have a study that we look at that effect. So if we look at the next one, so in this situation, we will focus on the kernel weight and the influence of nitrogen on kernel weight. Next, please. So here is a study, and then you will see that with nitrogen, we have a longer duration of green film. So here is a situation with no nitrogen, then nitrogen applying at different moments, P6 and flowering, and then even applying after flowering. In many situations, applying nitrogen after flowering doesn't do much good to the plant, because you are a little late. But yes, it shows that the problems of not having a good nitrogen nutrition in the corn. So this year, when you are taking decisions, be careful, because corn, it really doesn't like when we don't have any nitrogen in the soil. If you're planning to do that, don't put corn, because that's a problem, okay? You need to know that if you are putting any corn in the field, it needs nitrogen. And this is an example of showing that on the kernel weight, if you don't have nitrogen, in many situations, the duration for feeding the kernels, it will just shrink. So you have kernels that they will be lightweight. Okay? And that's a problem of not having a good nitrogen nutrition.
Ignacio?
Yes?
Last slide. I want to make sure that I'm tracking. The previous slide, you said that the blue varieties are looking for nitrogen after flower.
They are looking for nitrogen after flower, yes. And they are taking nitrogen from the soil.
Well, then we go to the slide that we just had.
Yes.
You're saying that nitrogen application after flowering
Does not work.
doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Which means that you need to make sure that you have all your nitrogen application done before flowering.
Before flowering.
Why? Because if you apply any nitrogen after flowering, and if you didn't apply enough before, most likely you will be compromising the kernel number. And if you compromise kernel number, 60% of the yields. Which basically is telling you that if you want to go or avoid application before flowering, I would say apply before flowering. Make sure that you have all your nitrogen in before flowering. The plant will, yes, the plant will use everything. If you go after flowering, well, in many situations we are not seeing much benefits. Because after flowering, the only thing that you might see, but I'm not sure who might pay for that, is an increase in protein content. Unless someone pays for that, in many of the research, the new research shows all the time that if you put more nitrogen after flowering, it just only impacts the nitrogen concentration in the kernels. So basically you put more protein, but the yields, same. Doesn't do much. So unless someone maybe soon will start paying for protein in corn, hopefully we'll find someone to buy protein in corn, it doesn't make any sense. You need to make sure that all your nitrogen is in before flowering. That's the key here. So we shouldn't be playing on doing something different, okay? And if you look at the next one, we also talk about this dry down. The dry down is something that I have a few questions every year about this. Dry down is the time that is going from harvest to maturity. If you look at corn, in many situations, we go really fast. I mean, if you look at the total number of days, I mean, yeah, the next one, yeah, you have the numbers there. So we usually go with 1% per day. So which basically means that you will go from maturity, usually around 36%, 35% of water in the kernels, all the way to 15, and it will take only just 2 weeks in a good weather condition. Be careful because last year was excellent weather condition. I'm not sure if we will have too many years like last year at the end of the growing condition. But for all the corn that is planted late, we are seeing that this can change. In many situations, if you plant late, usually you will put the corn into a different weather scenarios because most likely you will be maturing that corn towards the end of September. And then this will take, in some situations, double. It might take 30 days. All the way from going from maturity, when you see the black layer, okay, all the way to harvest. Because at that point, the plant doesn't do anything else. The plant is done, and you depend on the weather conditions, mainly temperature and precipitation. If you have good temperature, and if you don't have too much precipitation, that corn will go really fast and be ready to mature. I will always say to many of the farmers, although we are not in a soybean meeting, be careful with soybeans. Because the corn is not so much of an issue. On soybeans, you can go in a week. And I have many situations when farmers ask me about this, and I have a story about one guy that got 80 bushels. He called me, I went with him, we went to the elevator. I have a lot of fun that day. But when he got to the elevator, 80 bushels, 8%. 8% moisture. So can someone tell me how much money he lost? And I can tell you that he lost around $40, $50, I mean, in many situations per acre. Okay? And if you look at the numbers, I was saying, well, if you have 1,000 acres, you probably lost a truck. An entire brand new truck. And how long does it take to lose that truck? 4 or 5 days. Because what it takes is 4 or 5 days that you are not in the field, and then that soil was ready 5 days before. So be careful more on the soil, because many situations, I have many farmers asking us about, should I apply this, should I do this, should I apply this new biological, should I apply this new bacteria? And then, without even knowing, it doesn't care what you apply, but be on top of the harvest, because if not, you will lose a lot more than what you need to apply for bacteria or something. So. And I always say, well, do the ABC before you start thinking of the bacteria or anything crazy. So I'm not really a fan of many of those things. So the questions are, just to give you a last reminder on the kernel weight. Here is a scenario that we have a situation that we didn't do anything, a control, then a situation that we put an stress during flowering time, and then a situation that we put an stress during the reproductive, okay? And in many stages, you will see the different type of years. Just regular years, stress at flowering, you see 50% of kernel abortion. And then if you have a stress during the reproductive at the end of the season, what you will get to see on the picture is the upper section. Is the section that usually tend to abort, or even you can see some reduction in kernel weight. What you will see over time is that the kernel weight improve over time. And that's nice to see, that we were able not only to improve kernel number in the hybrids, but also we have some improvement in kernel weight. Okay? And that is why we are seeing still corn yield is still going up, because kernel weight is still one of the big factors that we never really quantify quite well. Okay, and the next section I will be talking about fertilizer very quickly, and then I will close with some of the on-farm research and the contest winners. I will not disclose who are the winners, but I will show some data. Adrian?
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Ciampitti for the chance of sharing some of the research I've been conducting during the last couple of years while pursuing my PhD that happily I defended last November, I guess. I already forgot about that. But all of my projects or the area I was working and I hope to keep working during the next couple of years is regarding the data integration and moving from static to more dynamic tools when generating prescriptions of recommendations. Particularly, I've been working towards nitrogen recommendations. So the main idea is, okay, we've been conducting many experiments, and many times we are just analyzing them isolated, right? We got the one field, 1 year, or even the more detailed analysis that we used to conduct is to divide by environments, low or to high yield environments, but many times we just get a prescription from 1 or 2 years of experiments, and we don't use to integrate that data or to look back to see what happened across locations, across years, to see if the models look more or less the same. So that's traditional, what we call traditional agronomy, right? So we are getting recommendations. In the best case, we are getting different environments, one line, regression line, associating yield with different variables. In this case, it's an example with plant density. But the main challenge that we have to face in the next couple of years is to move more towards quantitative agronomy. And that's what's been companies such as Corteva or Climate Corp, they've been working in the development of Encirca or the different tools that Climate have, right? They are creating different scenarios with different probabilities to happen in your field based on the variability you observe, based on soil data, weather data, and then performing some fancy models that we don't need to talk about, but this is what happened behind the scenes of all these new tools that they are coming over the next year. So that's the main challenge that we are facing in science when trying to provide you new recommendations or prescriptions for different inputs such as nitrogen that is very relevant during these days. During my PhD, one of the main projects was combining data from different locations across the US. This is a database of more than 1,000 experiments of nitrogen in corn across more than 18 different states here in the US and also 2 Canada provinces, mainly the corn provinces, Ontario and Quebec. And combining all of them, we were looking for different variables that we don't use to analyze very often when prescribing nitrogen recommendations. And one of these is how much nitrogen the soils I provide. Okay, so that is a very important variable that you may probably want to know during these days, right? How much nitrogen your soil is providing per se. Okay. So the idea was to take all the zero nitrogen plots from all these more than 1,000 experiments and trying to see if we can predict with different soil and weather variables across all these locations where we have a huge variability. We try to see if we were able to predict the yield with our nitrogen, and that we have an indicator of how much nitrogen is the soil supplying to the core. Okay, so the soil may provide a very wide range of amount of nitrogen. In this graph, you see in the y-axis the total nitrogen uptake of the 0 nitrogen plots, and in the x-axis you have the yield. So if you see, you may have an uptake from 50 to more than 350 kilos. Okay, that's all the 0 nitrogen plots. Okay, that's the variability that you may observe across locations and many times also within your field in terms of the supply of nitrogen just from the soil. And more or less the efficiency that these 0 plots are converting nitrogen to bushels of corn yield is they are using about 0.9 pounds of nitrogen to get 1 bushel of field. That's much more efficient than what we used to see when we have fertilizer plots. So somehow the plant is adapting and then it's very efficient for the use of nitrogen. But the idea of this is, okay, this 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per bushel is just one value, is the average, is the main line of, is the solid line that you see over there. So that is the slope of the line. But in fact, that has a variability. So that requirement of nitrogen it will be between 0.6 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So that's a variability that you might have in mind. So your soil may be provided between 0.6 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, depending on your yields, right? So when we are trying to study the response of nitrogen, it's not only the 0 nitrogen plots, because it's only one side of one part of the story. If we're having this in this graph, this is a classical regression model that we use to perform when trying to generate a prescription, trying to estimate this famous component, the economic optimal nitrogen rate, right? So we have the maize yield on the y-axis, the nitrogen array on the x, and then we perform a regression line, that's the theory, right? And then we'll have different components. The yield without nitrogen, it will be the first component, the V0 that you see over there, the intercept of that model, and then we have different components such as efficiency or the yield or to the economic optimal nitrogen rate that is supposed to be the most efficient rate to give us a prescription, right? But in the real world, what we have when we created these models, so in the next slide, we may see, this is when I was telling you that we were trying to predict this component of yield without nitrogen, and we try to play with different scenarios with no weather, with only with weather at the spring. That is the most, it's most likely what data you will have available when you are deciding nitrogen rate, right? Only using March to April or the beginning of May. So you may have that weather available when deciding the nitrogen rate. And with that, we may have a very decent prediction of the yield without nitrogen, right? And that prediction has 30 bushels per acre of uncertainty. That is considerable. And if we are thinking that this is a variable that is predicting our soil nitrogen supply, that uncertainty means that we have a noise, right, between 20 to up to 36 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That is the uncertainty we have on predicting the soil nitrogen supply in our soils. We use in soil a combination of soil and spring weather data. Okay? So in the next one, the idea is every time we are trying to generate the nitrogen recommendation, many times when the EONR is estimated, is using a single corn price and a single nitrogen price, depending on the cropping season, right? But if we consider that in the database we have, or those thousand experiments, we have variability over time. So many times if we have a ENR generated for the specific season where the experiment was conducted, we may have a very particular price ratio, right? That it could vary between 3 in this database towards 8. Now, with prices of today of $6 per bushel of corn and about $1, almost $1 for buying a pound of nitrogen, of anhydrous ammonia, we have a price ratio that is higher than ever. It's about 9 to 10, the price ratio. But if we just conduct the EONR for this specific year, we may have a different scenario of what happened 2 years ago, right? Or we have a EONR of a nitrogen curve, right? That will have the EONR estimated with the price ratio of 2018, right? So what to do? So what are the things that we can perform with these fancy models that I was mentioning, that we may include that variability, right? So we will have an idea of the uncertainty when generating the prescription of the economic optimal nitrogen rate. We must consider the prices variability, okay? So the idea with this graph is to show the prediction of this yield with a nitrogen, right? We have the predicted value on the y-axis and the observed on the x. So on the left side, on blue points, you have the yield with a nitrogen, that the prediction is pretty good. And then the other one will have the prediction of the famous EONR, that is much more noisy than predicting a component of yield such as the yield with a nitrogen. And that variability of 34% of the average, it means about 50 kilos in average of noise when predicting the EONR. I have an example. I think, Ignacio, that the slide got hidden.
Could be, yeah. See.
Might be.
Yeah, could be.
So that, yeah, I had a, if you might go back, yeah.
Yep.
Sorry. To the slide with the curve, yeah, that one. So this is the theoretical curve, right? This is how we see it on the books. We have a line, but we don't have a line in reality. We have a band, right? So that's the way we generate this prescription. Many times when giving a prescription, okay, we should simplify the message and give you a value, right? Because you have many other numbers in your head. It's not only nitrogen, but we think that we should be more responsible, I would say, when giving you the message that it's not a value. And many times we have, let's see, the example I put on a slide was, okay, I had a curve very similar to this, that it was estimated with 5 replications on the field for each of the nitrogen rates. And we have this beautiful curve, but in fact it was a very wide band. So we have a EONR of about 160 kilos of nitrogen, pounds of nitrogen per acre, but the range of that, the uncertainty was between 110 and 210. So it was 100 kilos of uncertainty. So many times that uncertainty could be 20 kilos. So we have cases where we are very precise on generating the prescription. But we have some others in specific conditions that the noise is considerable. So that's how we were trying to model, right? Not only the values, but also we may try to predict what is the uncertainty, because many times it's driven by soil or management, or we will see it by weather patterns. So we should show a couple. Yeah, that one. So the message of this figure is, okay, we try to predict the values, but we also try to predict the uncertainties, the noise. Because many times we have the same value of the yield with a nitrogen, of the same value of the economic optimal nitrogen rate, but with different uncertainty, right? So with this value, we have 3 different components. We have management components on green, soil components or variables that we use to predict on red, and on blue you will see the weather variables that we use to predict. And for both, for the uncertainty of the yield without nitrogen as well as the economic optimum nitrogen rate, they are mostly driven by weather variables. And many times those variables, some of them are happening before the season, like, I don't know, the VPD before planting, the 30 days before planting. That it could be a very good proxy of what is going to happen during the season, right? And many times we may have, I don't know, if the precipitations are even or not during flower. That is this weird SDI _3. That is the how even or not are the precipitations in the third month, that where the most likely flowering is happening, right? So with that, what we're trying to say, okay, management and soil variables may be important to predict the values of the nitrogen response components, but uncertainty is widely driven by weather variables. Okay? And many times what we are trying to do now is to explore how early in the season we can have good weather variables to predict what is going to happen next. Okay? But mostly all the uncertainties are driven by weather. So the main challenge we have is about the quality of the weather data we are managing. And with this, I give it back to Ignacio.
So I want to make sure that to close this, you understand that there are two things that are really hard to predict. It's easy to just do a study and do a prediction based on the study that we do, but it's really hard to really measure what is the uncertainty, the noise, how much noise we have. And then what we are telling you that in many situations when we are giving a number, in fact that number has a lot of noise. When you are saying 120 pounds, in fact it could be 20 plus or 40 plus, depending on the situation, okay? And then this is exactly what you need to know for this year when you are taking decisions on fertilization. Because you need to know how much room, potentially, you have to decide what is your rate. Again, don't be too short on corn, because that's a problem. And then in many scenarios, we always say, don't go all the way beyond, because in many situations, in this scenario, it will be really hard to even pay for that. Looking at the fertilizer price. So it's a big challenge. But what we are trying to show here too is that in many scenarios, the amount of nitrogen that is coming from soil is really hard to be predicted because it happens in the middle of the season. If you have good growing conditions, the plant is growing, if you have precipitation and temperature, the nitrogen will be released from the soil. And the plant will be able to capture because it will produce more roots and it will have the possibility to capture. Okay? So that is something that is important to know, that most likely when you are making the estimation of fertilizer, is never really an exact number, okay? And we can talk more about that. To close, I want to show some of the yield contest. It will be announced, it's January 27th, right? January 27th here in Salina. There is a commodity, the Kansas Corn Symposium first, and then the commodity classic. So if you really want to know and to get more information, you need to be attending. You can register to the Kansas Corn Symposium. But one of the things that I do, that I really enjoy doing, although it's a busy time of the year and I know that we are running because we have only just a few days to get this done, is to look at all the contests and the yield contest. And then the first thing that I do when I look at the yield contest and the winners, I check the data on plant density and fertilizer. Because these are farmers that they report to us what was the yield and also what was the plant density and the fertilizer that they use. And every year I finish looking at, and I always find the same graph. I always find that the high yielding contest is usually for those farmers that they plant early. For many, and how early? Not too early. In many situations, April 15. Most of the data shows April 15. I haven't seen too many farmers doing April 1st. That for me is too much of a risk. April 15 is a time that, as you see, if you move from April 15, which is the first point on the line on the figure A, the yield for that, or maximum yield in corn, starts going down as you move forward after April 15. Seeing rate, all the time. As you are seeing, we discuss all the presentation about seeing rates. The highest yield are coming from the highest seeing rates. Okay? And if you look at the numbers, I mean, this year we got one farmer that has 330 bushels, I think. At some point, I think that I discussed with Greg many years ago, and then we were talking, we will see, I mean, about 300 bushels in Kansas. 330 bushels, okay, this last year, okay? And if you look at the graph, all the time, more yield with more density. It's really straightforward, okay? This is data coming from farmers. Similar is on nitrogen. So be careful, as I mentioned before, and to close the message, you need more yield, you need to put more nitrogen. If you put less, assume that you are planning to get less yield, and then we are all happy. Done. That's the end of the story, okay? Because if you put less nitrogen, don't expect to see, oh, I put 100 pounds and I got 300 bushel. No. Or I put 100 pounds and I got 200 bushel. You will see that in many situations, in these high yielding contests, they are usually around 150, 180 pounds average, okay? And then just to close, I think that we already discussed many on this presentation, and I hope that is clear. My last message is the one at the end. I want to make sure that this year is the most important year for you guys to decide, but also to know that it's not one number. Plant density, fertilizer, the optimal rate is not a number. So you need to know what are your maximum and minimums and make sure that you play around those numbers. Okay? And then if you cut on fertilizer, you might need to think about cutting in other inputs, because it doesn't make any sense to cut in fertilizer. You will never get, just by cutting in one, you are cutting in one of the most important inputs. Okay? For us, fertilization and seeing rates, those two are the most relevant inputs for corn. If you cut in any of these two, it doesn't make any sense to add anything else, because you will start seeing a penalization in corn yields from there. That's everything that we have for today, so we will be around if you have any questions. We appreciate Kansas Corn for all the support to our team and for all the support on this research. And then I hope that you got the message that, I mean, we don't have a magical solution for all the questions that you have. But
all right. Hey, thanks, Ignacio. Okay, we're just in the schedule.